All right, we'll look at chapter 9 tonight. Start with chapter 9. Remember from last week that after Noah and his family left the ark, God said to Noah and to his sons, in verse 1, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Same mandate that he gave to Adam and Eve at the very beginning. So the world was going to continue on as God intended from the very beginning, but now through Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives. They really had the same responsibility that Adam and Eve had. Notice verse 2, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish in the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." What do you think that means?
It's part of the dominion thing, you know.
Okay.
You know, before that, all the animals will, have a fear of us, already instilled in them.
But not until after the flood. Dale?
Isn't it a little bit like another sort of repeat of the same edicts that were given to Adam and Eve at that point? Like, you now have dominion over everything. It's your responsibility to be caretakers of the earth and to ensure that you're managing it correctly. And
Yes?
or am I overreading?
No, that's exactly right.
And,
Their natural instincts are instilled.
Okay.
and then also too, things will change now, because back then they ate, like the, fruit and everything else.
Right.
Now, everything, man is eating meat now, and the sin and everything else, so that affected the animals too, so I believe that's all that has to do with it.
It's interesting that it says, "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the field." Before the fall, Adam and Eve had communion with the animals. They lived together, and the animals were not afraid of Adam and Eve. They weren't wouldn't attack them. Same way Adam and Eve were not going to kill them because they were not supposed to. But now, after the flood, we see that God says the animals will have a fear of you. There's a shift here in the man's relationship to the animals. And now animals are going to be fearful of men and women, especially men and mankind. And it seems like the implication is that now the animals are going to multiply tremendously, probably more so than men and women. And after a while, they would just kind of overrun the place if they were just allowed to live without any limitation to their lifespan. And so God now allows Adam and or Noah and his family and others who follow it then to kill the animals and to eat them. And this is a dramatic shift in the way animals and humans related to one another from before the fall. So is it, God's pretty specific when he says, "I give you everything. As I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." Are there any restrictions that are placed upon us as humans today as far as what we can eat?
No, but I don't, eat rare meat, so, with the blood thing, but other than that, they said, no,
Okay.
We're under grace,
Mm-hmm.
the Old Testament.
And this same principle that reiterated in the New Testament. Remember in Acts chapter 10 with Peter and the sheet that came down from heaven with all the animals in it? And Peter, being a good Jew, sees all these unclean animals in there and says, "I'm not going to eat that." And God says, "Don't you make unclean what I have declared is clean." And clearly we have the responsibility or the ability to eat any food that we want to now. Again, the shift that we see here beginning in Genesis 9. So Noah and his family are beginning now to establish a new life in the new land that's been provided for them. It's the old land, but it's totally different now. Looks different. Imagine when they first came out of the ark, what it must have been like. I mean, probably death all over the place. Probably the evidence of death everywhere. They looked for a while. But they set out to establish a new society in that land. And we're told that Noah became a farmer and set out to till the ground and to grow things and to continue his life, and probably his sons were doing very much the same kind of a thing. And that's how they began life in this second world that God created. And one of the things that Noah did as a farmer was to grow grapes. And he discovered somehow that he could take those grapes and he could crush them and he could make kind of a juice out of those grapes. Good afternoon. And he probably thought that this was pretty good. He enjoyed it, and it was good tasting, and maybe he made a lot of it. And after a while, the stuff that had been sitting around for a while kind of tasted a little bit different than the newer stuff that he was making. And he didn't realize it, but he had discovered the principle of fermentation. And now the world is exposed to wine for the first time. Nothing wrong with wine. The Bible makes that pretty clear, in moderation. But it all begins back here with Noah. So one day, Noah has had a little bit too much of this wine that he has made. And he, hold on a second here. I've got it totally ahead of myself, but we're okay. He drinks some of this wine, and he gets drunk. Maybe he didn't even realize that was going to happen. This may have been the first time, may not have been the first time, we don't really know. But he gets drunk from the wine that he had made. And he does something that's really pretty strange. He gets into this drunken stupor, and he goes into his tent, most likely, and takes off his clothes and falls asleep on his couch or whatever. Not totally unusual, because I've never gotten drunk. I mean, just not saying that proudly, it's just I never have. But I'm told that when a person gets drunk, very often one of the things they like to do is take their clothes off. I mean, that happens pretty normally. Maybe he was just hot or whatever, and so he takes his clothes off and falls asleep in this drunken stupor. And there's no indication in the text that there's any kind of sinful behavior that has taken place up to this point. He just gets drunk and falls asleep, and he's naked there on the couch. One of Noah's sons, whose name is Ham, he happens to come into the tent at that point, and he sees his father laying on the couch or whatever, and he sees his nakedness. That's, again, not an especially unusual occurrence. But when it says that he saw his father, the word for saw there really means something like he gazed at, he looked at kind of intently, with something more than just a casual interest. The word implies that Ham had some sort of received some kind of satisfaction from seeing his father like that. What that means, we're not exactly sure. But we do know that after a few moments, for a while of seeing his father like that, Ham goes and gets his two brothers, Shem and Japheth, and brings them into the tent. And they seem to know at the very beginning that this is not something that they ought to be looking at. So they kind of turn their backs to Noah and pick up the garment and put it in front of them, so that they did not see Noah, and put the garment back on him so that he was covered. A little while later, Noah wakes up from this drunken stupor, realizes that someone had placed his robe back over him. He must have realized that he had taken it off deliberately. But someone has now placed it back over him. And that incident results in a very, very interesting situation that developed right afterwards. What do you think went on there in that whole scene? Do you see any sinfulness involved? Any kind of behavior that's guilty of some type of judgment on the part of God, would you say? Bruce?
I would think there's like kind of parallel between Ham looking at his father and Eve being tempted by the serpent, you know, that whatever it is just kind of clicked in their human nature to, you know, to pursue. So I also get the impression that when he went out and told his brother, hey, let's go look at Dad, you know, it's, again, has that basically improper connotation, which again points to sin nature.
Okay.
You always want to be cautious filling in the blanks, but just knowing the nature of sin and just other records of probably some kind of perversion taking place.
Like what?
But maybe homosexuality, I'm guessing, and we just.
That's one
Be a guess.
one suggestion that's often made.
It's a suggestion that if the Lord punishes something, I mean, we know we have a just God, so God knows exactly what went down.
Mhm. Okay, any other thoughts?
I think it was, it's possibly, I mean, it was not implied in it, but from this, it could be like, he has been disrespecting his father for quite a bit, you know. because when he woke up, he knew what his son had did, so obviously it's something that has been going on. Now, we heard the, like the stuff like we were saying about the homosexuality thing and, all that kind of stuff like that. But whatever it was something that it was very disrespectful to him. And I think that it must have been something continuous. And I think it just finally just reached its peak.
Elijah?
Yeah, I was gonna say similarly, I've never actually heard, I've never heard an analysis of it kind of necessarily going towards homosexuality necessarily. But I think when I've read this passage in the past, it's been very much a tie to like a son disrespecting his father. And I get that sense even when he says at the end of verse 22, and told his two brothers outside, to know that they both walked in and laid the garment on their father. I don't get the sense that, from the text, I don't get the sense that Ham thought, okay, I look at my father and let me look at my brother so we can all lay this on him together. It's like, no, hey guys, why don't you come and look at dad?
Yeah.
When, Noah being, God's chosen man at the time as far as getting everyone out of the flood and things like that. But just showing a disrespect to his father and the one who the Lord had chosen to get them out of destruction that was to come. Just being a respect there, that clearly reverence that Ham did not have.
Okay, good. Dale?
I think there's also something to be said for like the leadership of Noah at that point, having let himself go to a point where he's losing a certain amount of respect in the eyes of those he's leading, being his family, by whether he was intentionally becoming drunk, whether he knew it or not. The way this whole thing plays out leads you to believe that it's probably not the first time that it happened, just based on the the consequences of everything else that happened there. But I think the judgment from God comes from, you're appointed as God's representative or God's man to save everyone, and look at the way you're acting. You're losing face essentially in front of your own family.
Yeah. Okay.
Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? As the Lord knows it, God tries the reins, and it's just an example of things that the Lord knows what sin can do to people. Crazy these thoughts if you don't keep things in check.
That's absolutely true. But I think the question here is, what is the sin?
Right.
Because
It's not
there's
reported.
nothing stated, obviously, that there was any kind of sin involved. There's some things that are solely implied. Danny?
Back then, when they talk about nakedness and stuff like that was really big, back in the Old Testament. And then if you sort of bring it up today and knowing, like I said, I've locked up many, people who were drunk and all that.
Yeah.
And I've seen how it affected family. You always have maybe one or two of them, let's say if they have children, they may have, let's say they have 3 kids. One of them will lose respect for the father. He's always drunk, he's this and that and this. And they tend to make fun of him. If he's on the ground or something, they look down on him and everything else. The other two, will hold on to, look, regardless, that's still dad, But I know that, as you read that nakedness back then was a big thing. That it wasn't good for a person to show their nakedness.
Yeah, shame.
And, how it was, it brought shame upon them. And I think that when he seen that, he made fun of it. And not only showed disrespect to the father, but then he tried to get his brothers to do the same thing as he did, and they refused to do it. And, if you see, like I said, in the day, you'd be surprised that's how it normally works in a family dynamic.
Interesting.
That's good.
Interesting. You all know that Danny's a retired cop. Do you know that? That's what he's talking about.
Just
A lot of experience with drunkenness.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
a whole lot.
Well, as I said, there certainly is something going on here, and I don't think there was any any homosexual act going on. I don't think there was anything like a rape, which are another thing that's often mentioned here. But I think Ham has probably had some kind of a rebellious streak within him that's kind of been latent, hasn't been so obvious up to this point, until he sees his father in the condition that we've discussed already. Said pretty much, humiliated in front of his sons, and whatever respect Ham might have had for Noah before, which I think was great, he kind of loses it when he sees his father like that. And this long hidden resentment toward his father, toward his father's authority, kind of comes to the surface. I mean, here's my father, who's this example of moral uprightness. He's God's man to lead us through the flood and to bring us to this new society. And look at him. And that just kind of triggers this rebellion, this disrespect for authority that maybe has been inside Ham for a while. And it all just kind of comes out when he sees his father like this. I don't think there's any overt act, sexual act, that occurs on this occasion. But it's more of an awakening within Ham of these rebellious feelings that he's had, and it just comes to light now when he sees his father in this situation. Ham goes and gets his brothers and tells them to come, and I think Elijah's right. He's saying, come and see, Dad. Look at this guy that you're all so respectful of. Look at him right now. Well, they don't want to buy into that. They still see Noah for who he was, and so they go in very respectfully, cover him, and don't have any part of seeing his nakedness. Noah, when he awakens, realizes that something has happened, and as a result, he pronounces a curse and 2 blessings. And this is where the story gets real interesting. In verse 25. He says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And if you've done any reading about this text in any of the commentaries, you know this is a very controversial passage of Scripture. And the interpretations run all over the place. First question I think we ought to answer is, why does Noah curse Canaan and not Ham? Ham was the one that did all of this, who saw his father's nakedness. Canaan, of course, was Ham's youngest son. 3 older sons. Canaan was the 4th of Ham's son. But the curse is pronounced upon Canaan rather than Ham. Any thoughts as to why that is?
It's kind of a parallel of like Adam's curse being passed down to the whole human race. Maybe God had revealed to Noah that Canaan would produce a line of people that again would become the subservient ones.
I read some time ago, and it said because when they came off the ark, that God blessed Ham. So if God blessed Ham, then, Noah couldn't curse
Noah's
him.
not gonna curse him, right?
Right, so he, did it, to his son, for him to, that, because his son wasn't blessed, Ham was.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I think we're on the right track.
Yeah, here a little bit like the generational sins, like the offspring being
Okay.
punished.
God visits the sins of the
The
fathers
history of
upon the
the
third
blessings
and
and
fourth
cursings follow
generations.
God, blessed that don't, cursings, kind of that pattern.
Okay. Here's a thought that I think has some merit to it. Ham was on the ark as a believer, as a righteous man, because all 8 of those people on the ark were. Still a believer. Lose his salvation. He's still a believer, even though he's done something that may not have been right. Still a believer, and so Noah understands that he really can't curse his son who's a believer.
I see.
And it may very well be that Ham's first 3 sons, Cush, Mizraim, and Put, were also believers to the influence of Noah and their father. But Canaan may have been the first in that line who was not a believer. And that's why Noah puts the curse upon him. It was Ham that did this act, but he's not going to be cursed because God has blessed him. He is a believer. Noah understands that. But it seems like Noah maybe prophetically, under the inspiration of God, is able to see into the future to some degree and understand that Canaan is not going to be a believer. And so he lands the curse on him. I think there's some merit to that. The point is that this rebellious act, if that's what we want to call it, on the part of Ham, was going to come to full fruition in the life and the family of his youngest son, Canaan. I think that's a plausible explanation. And what is the nature of the curse?
That could be,
Well, here's where it gets real interesting.
well, it could always be subservient, to them.
What is that phrase in the ESV? It says servant of servants. And what it means more literally? Anybody have another translation of that?
Where was that again? Genesis.
9:26, 25. Anybody have an old King James? I think it's a slave of slaves.
A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren.
Okay. Anybody else, any other translation with it? I think the old King James says slave of slaves. And the intent really is the lowest of slaves. That's what it's trying to say. That's what it literally means. Well, how do we interpret that? Some have suggested that Canaan was going to become the father of a nation of slaves. The problem with that interpretation is that historically, we know it's not true. We know of the lineage of Canaan and some of his ancestors who followed after him. And they developed into some great nations that were not slaves of anybody else. They were powerful leaders of nations. So it can't just mean that Ham is going to become a slave to other nations around them, because historically it just didn't happen. Depending on who you read, if you read some of the more liberal commentators, they will probably try to tell you that this is what is called a curse of Ham, and it resulted in the Negro people. Is that a term that I can use today, Danny?
Yeah, I go with it. You know what it is, normally you say black or whatever, or you could say Negro too, but, I think, you know, a lot of times, especially today, it depends on the person's mentality,
Okay,
you know, it really does, you know.
okay. So, the interpretation then, that some people have, is that this is a curse that's placed upon Ham, or Canaan, and his progeny, who are going to become the father of black people, Negro people. And the curse upon them was that they were going to be slaves. And they suggest that this is going to be the case because these people who came from Canaan were an inferior race of people, and basically all they were good for was to be servant of servants, or slave of slaves, the lowest of slaves. Vicki?
I have a different saying about that.
Okay.
It says in that verse, 9:25.
Right.
The verse has been wrongfully used to support racial prejudice and even slavery. Noah's curse, however, wasn't directed toward any particular race, but rather at the Canaanite nation, a nation God knew would become wicked.
Okay. That's exactly right. Exactly right. This curse has nothing to do with black people being inferior in any way whatsoever. That's not what this curse is all about. In fact, I think it is so interesting that if you read commentators written before about 1800, nobody mentions that as an interpretation.
No.
It's not until the middle of the 19th century, when slavery in England and the United States was at its height, that somebody came up with this idea that black people are the result of the curse upon Ham. And there's nothing further from the truth than that.
So social justification for something written in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So there is no way that you can support, well, two things. You can't support biblically at all that black people are inferior to anybody else, because how many races are there? One. Where did we all come from? We came from Noah. Before that, we came from Adam and Eve. Every single one of us came from the same place. And the Bible never uses the term race. It talks about people groups, nations that developed, groups of different kinds of people that developed and established a nation, but the Bible doesn't talk about races of people, different kinds of people. There's human beings. That's the race, or the human race. Dale?
You know, it's funny you mentioned that. Elijah and I did a VBS, was that
Oh,
2 years ago, about the Tower of Babel and the
Yeah.
fall and the spread of nations and all that stuff.
Talking about
And
the
we-
melanin?
Yeah,
exercise?
and we had a color wheel up, you know, of all the different shades, and that we used Elijah and myself as the reference, and we asked them to tell us what was different between the two of us. Would you believe they picked, man, everything you can think of except the color of our skin,
Yeah.
my watch, his watch, our
Yeah.
boots, like, I mean, these kids were throwing out 1,000 different things that made us different, and not one of them had to do with anything.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
yeah, it is. It is.
That's all I could think about when you were talking about it.
So, I'm looking for a verse. Where did the races, the idea of races come from? Acts 17, verse 26, and he, God, made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find it. God created the race, and there's one race, the human race. Obviously, when Noah came off the flood with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Shem wasn't white, Ham wasn't black, and Japheth wasn't yellow. They all looked exactly the same, as far as their skin color is concerned. It was just one race of people. And from that now has developed all these different people groups that we, mostly secular sociologists and so forth, call races, but it wasn't that way. That's not what God intended. That's not the way he created people. Races, as we understand it, is something that has developed through, we'll get to that in a minute when we get to Tower of Babel.
Hold that thought.
So the point is that the curse on Ham, which is really a misnomer, it's not even really a curse, has nothing to do with black people being inferior. It is in no way a justification for slavery. It does not support racism in any sense of the word. So just get that out of your mind if you even ever thought about that. What does it mean then? They're going to be servant of servants. Anybody understand what that phrase means? Here's a kind of a wild explanation for you. If you follow through in Genesis 10, the table of nations, and you see the line of Canaan and who came after him, I mean, there are a lot of nations in there that we don't at all associate with being a black nation or populated by black people. So it may be suggesting that from Canaan is going to come this one group of people who were going to be so adept at their ability to make things and do things and understand things that are going to be helpful and beneficial to the rest of mankind. And Morris, in his commentary, goes into a lengthy explanation of this that I don't want to get into this afternoon. But they may have been responsible for the original understanding of things like technology and science and mathematics and agriculture and all these things that were needed for the world to grow. And in that sense, they became the servants or the stewards of the rest of the people, providing for them things that they absolutely needed for mankind to continue to grow on. I think it makes sense. And in this case, it's not really a curse in the sense of, some dire, terrible thing's going to happen to you. It's just a prediction of what's going to be in the future. And of course, to some extent, Canaan was very rebellious nation. I mean, they became Israel's arch enemies when they finally got into the promised land. God told Israel, go into the promised land, what do? Drive out all the Canaanites, get rid of them, kill them, every one of them.
Bunch of Baal worshippers, right?
Sure, they were all pagans. So in that sense, they had to be dealt with, but it wasn't just the Canaanites, there were a lot of other people that were progeny of the Canaanites. And in many cases, they did a lot of good things that benefited society or civilization as a whole. To Shem, Noah says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." Who do you think that's referring to? Who's the line of Shem? Semites, anti-Semitism.
Jews.
Who are we talking about? The Jews, of course. The Jews are from the line of Shem. This is most likely a blessing, a prediction that through Shem ultimately is going to come the Messiah, who's going to be a blessing to all. It's kind of a reiteration of 3:15. You know, the promise of, not 3:15, 3:7, or whatever, the promise of the one who's going to come and bruise the head of the serpent, but he was going to be the victor ultimately. And then to Japheth. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Doesn't mean literally live in the same tent with him. That's a sign of fellowship, of coexisting with one another. And it just seems to be a general blessing that through the Japhites and those people followed after him, all the people that associate with them would be blessed in some particular way. It's really a hard passage to understand. But the point that I wanted to really emphasize in this age in which we are living today is that the blessing upon Canaan, or the curse upon Canaan, has nothing to do with any sense of justifying racism or racial inequality, or one group of people is superior to another group of people. You don't find anything like that in any place in Scripture. In fact, just the opposite, of course. In Old and New Testament, the emphasis was love your neighbor, care for your neighbors, help one another. And that's the way it ought to be for believers. Okay, so that's the curse on Canaan. And as I said, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. Let's go back to verse 1 and look at what we're told here. And let's just move ahead to, let's go to verse 4 of chapter 9. God says, "You shall not eat the flesh with its blood, with its life," that is, its blood. So God has just said, you can eat anything you want, eat the flesh, eat the meat of anything, but not the blood. Why not? Why was the blood set apart as being something that they were not to partake of?
They said that's part that contains the life of, human or animal, whatever it is.
Okay. And what does God typically do with blood in Scripture? It's used for what?
Sacrifices.
Sacrifice. So God is upholding the principle that life is sacred. Animal life, sacred to a degree, especially human life. And its blood is not to be eaten, not to be consumed, because God was reserving that for his use in sacrifices. And he says, verse 5, "For your blood, for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. In other words, if blood is taken from an individual, a person's blood is taken, God determined that there needed to be a reckoning. That word means a compensation or a satisfaction. If the life of an individual is taken, there needs to be compensation for that life. Even among the animals. Remember in the Mosaic Law, in Exodus 21, God says if your ox gores or another ox or something, you gotta kill that ox that did that. You gotta take that life. Kind of the eye for an eye principle. It applies to human beings as well. So God says in verse 6 then, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. If a person willfully takes the life of another individual, then God has established that his life needs to be taken as well as satisfaction or compensation for that previous life. Why is God establishing that principle? Because man is created in the image of God, and man is sacred. And to emphasize the sacredness of mankind, God establishes this basic principle. You take the blood, you take the life of that man, then your blood is going to be required from you. Now, this is not vengeance on the part of God. It's not what we're talking about. This is justice.
Yep.
You take the life of another man, you have to give up your life. This is not talking about war. It's not talking about accidental death. It's talking about premeditated murder. You just willfully take the life of an individual. God says, your life will be required of you. This is God's basic requirement, basic principle for the establishing of human government. This is where it all begins. Life is precious, God is saying. You don't have the freedom as an individual just to take life because you want to for any reason. And undoubtedly, that kind of thing was most likely going on before the flood. We talked about all the wickedness that was in the world. People were undoubtedly killing one another. They learned that from Cain and Abel, and it's just been repeated for all those years before the flood. And God said, this is going to stop. You've got to understand how sacred and how precious life is. And so we're going to establish this as a principle. This is going to be the basis upon which human life is going to conduct itself. You take the life of another person, your life is required of you. Okay, here's a question. Cain kills Abel. Willfully, premeditated, it's murder. Why didn't God take his life?
Because he's merciful.
He's merciful.
Hadn't been decreed by God yet.
Yeah. But remember what it says in that story?
It says that anybody who sees him, that they will kill him. And that's when he put the mark on him.
After Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? The Lord says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. What does that mean? It means basically that Abel's blood is crying out for satisfaction. It needs to be recompensed for. You took his life, someone's got to pay for that. And so the Lord goes on and says, now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive wanderer on the earth. And he says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. It's like Canaan almost realized, even back then, that he had done something so terribly wrong that he should have given up his own life for having taken his brother's life. But God is merciful, and that principle had not yet been established at this point. So Cain is allowed to live. But as that continued throughout the days before the flood, and it became so out of control, now as this new civilization is beginning, God said, here's going to be the basis for human government. Life is precious, it's sacred. All human life is created in my image. You're not going to just destroy the image of me by taking another life willfully. If you do that, you're going to pay for it. Your life's going to be required of you. Capital punishment still a legitimate crime, a legitimate punishment for crime today?
Well, the way they do it, no, because it doesn't deter. Because even though a person is, put on death row, he stays there 30, 40 years or whatever. And, basically by the time he dies, is, a man's life, normally what they would live, he done reached. And in this case, the justice that should have been done is forfeit, until a later date. But if it was, I did a paper on that, but if it was initiated, if they, initiated, then it will be a deterrent. A lot of people will value life more, but they know that nowadays it's, if they come up with an excuse or something or some kind of legal thing, they can, be taken off. So it's not taken seriously.
Okay, so the system as it is in our country doesn't work very well. But the principle of capital punishment, or a life for a life, is that something that still should be enacted in our world today?
In most cases, yes.
Sure. And, you say it's not a deterrent, Danny, and that's an argument that a lot of people say. It's certainly a deterrent to somebody. That guy who's put to death, who endures capital punishment, he's not going to kill anybody else.
Yeah, the old-fashioned horse thief hangings in the West, and the kids all went to see like a big event.
Yeah.
Might have been a good deterrent. Don't be doing that. I mean, I'm just going back and.
Yeah.
But normally, in a sense, what I mean in a sense is that, let's say for instance, like he just said, but most family come because they want justice, but if it was something that was saying, well, you know what, if anyone does this will happen to them, then it can be more of a general form of punishment, and people say, wow, if I do this act, without a justifiable reason,
Right.
then I wouldn't do it. But now when they see it, this guy goes in 1980, and he's not executed until 2020,
Right.
So I mean,
Yeah.
he's still living, he's, everything else, he's worrying about dying.
Mm-hmm.
The family who lost, someone, they cannot let go, they don't have no closure.
Yeah.
But life keeps on going on,
Right.
and You know, now when his time comes, they finally killed him, you know.
Yeah.
You know, but it's not a deterrent because they said, well, hey, you know, you wait all these years, you know, so.
Is capital punishment a New Testament principle?
Forgive your brother 70 times 7.
Come on, people.
Age of grace. Oh,
Jesus in the garden before his crucifixion, the soldiers come. Peter gets all upset, takes out his sword, swings at cut off the head of his shoulder and cuts his ear off instead.
yeah.
Jesus puts his ear back, says to Peter, put your sword away.
Yeah.
If you live by the sword, you're gonna die by the sword.
Yeah.
Isn't that what Jesus is saying?
Mm.
If you take the life of someone,
Yep.
your life is gonna be required of you. Paul in Acts 25 stands before the Roman authorities and was accused of a crime, a capital crime, as far as Rome was concerned.
Yeah.
And Paul's statement there was, in effect, if that's what you think you need to do, I am really ready and willing to accept my execution.
Mm.
He recognized that capital punishment was still in effect. And if he had violated the law in the way that it was written by the Romans in that case, then he should have been executed. He didn't fight it. He didn't say, I'm going to get a good lawyer and beat this thing.
Yeah.
That was the law of the land. And then you have Romans 13. He does not hold the sword in vain, but he is an instrument of God to deal with individuals who break the law. And 2 or 3 times in that passage, Paul mentions the sword. What do you do with a sword?
Kill somebody with it.
Depends on.
You don't spank somebody with a sword. It's not talking about a long prison sentence. It's not talking about a fine. A sword is an instrument of killing. And Paul says the government has the right, they have the sword, and they have the God-given right, they're instruments of God, Paul says, to carry out capital punishment when it's proper. Now, you get in a whole big argument about the legal justice system today, you know, people that are accused of crimes that they didn't commit and all that. Well, that's part of our sinful nature. We're not perfect and we make mistakes, but the principle which is established here in Genesis 9 is still in effect today. Very much in effect. I mean, when God establishes principle in Genesis 9, this is the foundation of human government, as I said. I mean, if you didn't have some law establishing a penalty, a severe penalty for murder, you know, pretty soon you'd have anarchy, and that's pretty much what they had before the flood. Everybody was just running around doing whatever was right in their own eyes. God said, because there was no government back before the flood. I mean, people kind of meted out their own justice, whatever they thought they wanted to do to somebody who violated them. God says that's going to stop now. There's going to be a limit. There's going to be a government, some mechanism to say this is right, this is wrong. You do this, you get punished. You do this, you get rewarded. And it starts right here with capital punishment, where it all begins. And the principle continued right on through the New Testament. So it is clearly something that God sees as being available and useful for the world in which we live today. lot of controversy about that, to be sure. And it is not carried out as it should be, but the principle is still in existence. Let's go over to chapter 10 for just a moment. Chapter 10 and last half of chapter 11 is really a fascinating chapter, but it's just too complicated to get into. But it's the listing of the generations after Noah and his 3 sons here upon the earth. And if you get a good commentary, you can trace the names of these individuals and see the nations that came and developed as a result of their families growing up and settling in different parts of the world and so forth. So it's really a fascinating discussion. I commend you to take some time for yourself to try to figure out who these people are and how they fit into the biblical chronology. But in chapter 10 and verse 8, we meet this one guy. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, a few other lands. Nimrod, he is one of the key players in this progeny that developed after Noah and his 3 sons. Named Nimrod means, let us rebel. And he did. It says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. It doesn't mean he was hunting animals. It probably means he was a mighty warrior, a violent man who sought out people and killed them for his own benefit, for the promotion of his own ideas. He's a mighty hunter before the Lord. And he is the one who is largely responsible for the events that take place surrounding the Tower of Babel. Turn over to chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Fascinating statement. One language, and really what that means, same words, means the same vocabulary. If you've ever gone to England, for example, and you say, well, I have no problem getting along, getting around people, because we speak the same language, but not necessarily the same vocabulary. English people say a lot of things that we wouldn't understand. Even the way they say them sometimes just sounds very different to us, so we'd have trouble communicating. Well, not back in this day. One language, one vocabulary, everybody understood, everybody clearly, no problem at all. And because it was one language, it made it very easy for people to communicate. Even if they settled in a small area not too far from where this takes place, they could travel not too far and meet other people, and they'd be able to talk with them without any problem. That's a great advantage if you wanted to establish one single, unified, worldwide government. Everybody spoke the same language. That'd be a great advantage. And God understood that, of course. And so as many people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So all these people, and now these are all the descendants of Noah and his 3 sons. They haven't traveled too far yet from where the ark landed. And they get together one day, and they realized that if they were even more unified in some way, there would be no stopping them. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted. That's exactly what they say. We're going to build for ourselves a city. We always talk about the Tower of Babel, but this is a city that they're building. The centerpiece of that city was going to be this tower. So they're building a place that was going to be the habitation for all of these people that were part of this whole thing. Probably most of the world's population at that point, maybe. And they said, let us make a name for ourselves. That's probably the key. Why are they doing this? They want to honor God? No. This is all about greed, selfishness, and humanism, and the power of man. We're going to do this for ourselves. We're going to make a name for ourselves. Everybody's going to know about us, who we are, what we have been able to do. And so they said, well, let's get some bricks and bitumen. You ever been to the Holy Land or the Mideast? You don't see too many houses made out of stone. Stone is not very common in the Middle East. Everything's sand all over the place. But they discovered centuries ago that they can make bricks. That's what the Egyptians did to the Israelites, right? That's what they had to do all day long, make bricks for Pharaoh's cities. So they had these bricks, and they figured out how to put them together. We're going to make this city, I'm going to make this tower that's going to reach its top in the heavens. Now, that's probably not the best translation there of what's going on here. They didn't literally think they were going to build a pathway to go to heaven. What the suggestion is, they're going to build this tower that's going to tower above the city, and it was going to be a place where they could meet the gods. Did you ever hear of a ziggurat? You can read that word?
Yeah.
A ziggurat's like a square tower with steps going up one side and then the other side, and they're ascending all the time until it reaches a high level. And these ziggurats were built all over the Middle East as places to worship pagan gods. And their thinking here is that they're going to build this tower that's going to give them a place where they can go and meet their gods. They'll go up, the gods will descend to them, and gods will be in control of this great city and this civilization that they're going to build, and we are going to be the kings of the earth, basically, is what they're thinking. Well, God's watching this whole thing take place. In verse 5 it says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men had built. Kind of mutual parallel, Adam and Eve, after they sinned, God comes into the garden looking for them to see what they're doing. Where are you? God comes down to see what these people after Noah are up to. What are you building? And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. For nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So God realizes that if they were successful in this venture, they would be so filled with pride and self-will and power that they would try anything, even to the extent of just ruling the whole world without any regard for God, because their purpose was to worship the false gods. And so God says, let us come down, notice again the plural, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another. So God does exactly that. He, in some way, caused confusion of languages among all these people, so that now they can't communicate with each other. So they can't explain how to build this thing. They can't explain what they want to do. They can't communicate in other ways, and it was just like chaos all of a sudden. And so the Lord then dispersed them over the face of all the earth. He left off building the city. And that explains how nations actually began, how people began to inhabit the entire earth. It was not a natural migration after the flood. People just didn't automatically set out and say, well, I'm heading to Florida, and some said, I'm heading to Europe, and whatever. They all just congregated. They pretty much stayed in that area for a while, until they got this great idea that they're going to build a city that's going to give them the power to rule over everything. And God specifically caused them to be dispersed throughout the entire world. And that's where nations and people groups come from, because of the result of the Tower of Babel. Therefore the name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all of them, and the Lord there dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now, isn't it interesting that after the Tower of Babel, these people go to all these different parts of the world, and probably, obviously, not probably, but obviously, after a period of time, they've inhabited the whole earth. Remember again that the earth, after the flood, was significantly different than the earth before the flood. It may have been easier for them to travel to some parts of the world. Maybe there was ways that they could get from one great landmass to another without having a lot of technology or whatever. Or maybe they were smart enough at that point to build boats. They saw what Noah did. Maybe they said, well, we can do that too. We'll sail over to wherever and start our nation over there. But in any case, the dispersion of the nations is a direct result of an act of God. Had nothing to do with evolution. It wasn't just mankind thinking he wants to go someplace else. God did it. Just one other thing. When all this started, beginning of chapter 11, there was one language. After the nations were dispersed, they all developed their own languages. And they continued doing that for centuries. So that I think maybe like 100 years ago or so, there was something like 6,000 languages, dialects, whatever, in the world. And everybody had spread all over the place. Many, many different languages throughout. book of Revelation tells us that in the end days, during the tribulation, the world is again going to be seeking after a one world government. It's one of the characteristics of life in the tribulation. In fact, it even calls the name of that desire Babel, the mother of harlots. Babylon in the tribulation is going to be the final step of what started here in Genesis 11. Man trying to establish a worldwide government with just one ruler, that being the Antichrist at that point, who has no regard for God, but wants to establish his world, his kingdom in the way that he wants, and they will try to attempt to do that during the tribulation. But again, in order to communicate with a worldwide population like that, you have to communicate, have to speak the same language. Do you realize that in the last 50 years or so, the number of languages in the world has decreased dramatically? I mean dramatically, like maybe there's 1,000 now. And some people who study this kind of stuff think that it's very real that before long, English is just going to be the worldwide language. That everybody will be able to communicate in English. As we get closer and closer to the coming Babylon that God talks about in Revelation. Genesis 11, one language. People are scattered, there's many languages. Now we're moving to the next Babylon. We're getting closer to that place where there's one language, again, on the face of the earth. Babylon is, Tower of Babel is incredibly important. I mean, obviously sin was still prevalent after the flood. These people who lived after the flood, soon after the flood, were intelligent beyond our imagining. Able to build this tower, create these bricks, and build this tower almost as high as they wanted it to go. It shows they had a complete disregard for God. There's other books that you can get, and you will soon discover that every false religion, every pagan, idol-worshipping religion in the world today traces its ancestry back to Babylon somehow. It all started right there. And we're just seeing the culmination of it today in our world, with all the false religions, all the paganism, all the stuff that's going on today. It started here in Genesis 11, and it's here today. Tower of Babel explains where language comes from, explains where different cultures came from. All these people went to different parts of the world and established their own nation states and developed traditions and languages and cultures. And those cultures have multiplied time and time again. And that's where we get culture today. So God gave the human race ample opportunity. Started with Adam and Eve, put them in a perfect environment. They messed it up, they sinned. God cast them out. People who lived after them became so wicked that God said, I regret that I created mankind. I'm going to destroy all these people. Destroys everybody except Noah and his wife and his 3 kids and their wives. Starts civilization all over again. And before too long, it's going the same way that the original civilization went. And so now God is going to show us how he narrows down his focus of the earth from this worldwide opportunity that he has given people to follow him and to serve him. He put enough people along the way that everybody could have had a knowledge of God if they wanted to. But God's done with that now, and he says, okay, I'm gonna choose one group of these people on the earth, and I'm gonna set them apart, and I'm gonna do things for them that I've never done for any other group of people. I'm gonna provide them with things that others have never had. I'm gonna give them instructions. I'm gonna raise up people, leaders for them, and they will become the ones whom I have chosen to lead the human race and to fulfill my purposes for the earth from this point on. And so when we get to chapter 12, now we have the establishment of Abraham's family, which ultimately, of course, becomes the Jewish people, and to the rest of the Old Testament, God's dealing with Israel, and shows us how they were his servants sometimes, and many other times they failed him completely and went their own way, followed some of these pagan gods, and God had taken them into captivity, and you know the rest of the story until we get to the New Testament, where God says, Israel, you've had your chance. I'm going to put you aside for a while. Now I'm going to start working through another group of people called the church. And that continues on through the New Testament. So beginning next week, we'll look at Abraham and Israel and how they fit into Old Testament prophecy, Old Testament history. We're gonna fly through these last 4 chapters. As I said at the very beginning, last 39 chapters of Israel are really a story of 4 men, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we're just gonna look at each one of them very, very briefly. And hopefully whet your appetite to do some study on your own, because all 4 of them are fascinating characters and important to biblical history, to world history. So that's what we'll do next week. Awful lot of good books written on the history of Genesis. Get a couple of them and read it. Fill in all the gaps that we've created for you. Any questions real quick? Here we go. Comments? Anything?